everyone. My name is Steve Saranovic. I'm a member of the IIEP, and I'm here to introduce a very provocative title or topic, which is the myth of the U.S.-China trade war. And I'm kind of hopeful that maybe by the end of this, we'll just learn that this was all a dream. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. Our two speakers today are Jiandong Ju, who's from Tsinghua University. He'll speak first, followed by Mary Lovely at Maxwell School at Syracuse and with the Peterson Institute. So turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Mackie. Thanks to invited me. So I attended this same conference 2 years ago. That was an election day, and that being after 2 years, I come to this conference again. I found these 2 years many things changed. So I was so feel so different. And one thing I feel very different is interesting because I'm a trade economist, and thanks to Mr. Trump to make my job much more important. So that's also a very interesting phenomena. Here it's asked me to discuss about the U.S.-China trade relations, and because Maggie told me as in the program, I'm the only professor come from mainland China. So, but let me try to claim. So I'm a professor, so I do not represent Tsinghua University. Nevertheless, I definitely not represent China. So although I come from China, I only represent myself to explain as a professor, and so what's the observations to current situations, which. Well, I currently, yes, I'm working in Tsinghua University. We have a team which started 2 or 3 years ago. It's even a bit longer time. It's from there are several people, and some people are from the Tsinghua University, some people are from the Columbia University. So here, I will come back to the title. Title we say is so-called Asian Community and a Tripolar Global Economic Governance. So I think it's a good time to talk about the what's a global governance. Actually, I try to talk about 3 things. The first is the U.S.-China trade disputes and the long-range growth. So that's first. I use one diagram to explain so what's my understanding. Second of all, I try to explain what's the facts we observe in so-called structural changes in globalizations. So that's also one or 2 diagrams. Then, well, I feel it's very hard to discuss what's going on now. What happened in the near future about U.S.-China. So instead, why don't I talk about 40 years later? So I think it's much easier for me to talk about what happens in 40 years later, what's the ideal global governance. So in that sense, I would work on a theoretical model. So if there were a world social planner, what would be the optimal global governance systems? So that would be 3 parts of my presentation. So each probably take about 6 or 7 minutes. Okay, so now let me talk about U.S.-China trade disputes. Again, I'm not going to talk about what's really happening because I don't understand. But let me try to use as a trade economist. Let me use a diagram to explain what could happen. This is Chinese. I want to show I'm from China. But so you don't understand. However, you could understand these diagrams, right? So let me explain about what's this diagram. the vertical line is GDP, the vertical line. And the horizontal line is years. The years from 1978 to 2018 until 2060. So it's 8 years time horizon. And so what happened from the last 40 years, it's the historical data we already observed. And we are now in 2018, so we try to see what's going on in the next 40 years. So that's the things that we try to analyze. I use this blue line to represent the world. I use this black line to represent US. I use this red line to represent China. So that's the 3 lines. And so these are total growth, or the total GDP. So it represents total GDP. And I discussed the 3 scenarios. And here it's a scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. So let me explain these 3 scenarios in the future. First of all, let's understand what's going on in past 40 years. In past 40 years, US growth is about, average is 2.3, 2.2%. And US growth rate, per capita GDP growth rate, it's very stable, 1.5% every year on average, due to the population growth, and the GDP growth is about 2.3, 2.2. So it's very, very stable. From 1978 to 2018, in the 40 years, the average growth rate for China is 9.5%. Mainly due to these 2 countries' growth, mainly from data. And the spillovers to the rest of the world. The world also document the pretty good healthy growth. It's about 4.5, 4.2% in the past 40 years. And until 2018, China's GDP is about 60 to 70% of the US GDP. Depends on what the price you use, or your purchasing power PBT you use. Okay, then what happens from 2018? So let's see 2060. Let's see what would be in 2060. To understand what would be 2060, we needed to go back to see what happens in the last 40 years. The people, the economists like me and like other people understand, we think in past 40 years, there are main 2 reasons to drive this economic growth. Number 1, technology improvement. Basically this information technology, and which is an important driver for the past 40 years growth. Second of all, globalization. Right? So this is the major 2 reasons for the growth in the past 40 years. Okay, what happens after 2018? Many of people think the 4th industrial revolution is coming, represented by the AI industry. So there are enough reasons to think there will be at least as similar important technology improvement in the future than we have observed in past 40 years. People even think it's much greater than that. The human as a human being may significantly change in the next 40 years. Robots, but there is enough reason to think there will be another wave of industrial revolutions. And so we know next 40 years, they are an important driver for in the technology region. Suppose the globalization will continue. Suppose, then I would assume the growth patterns will be similar as last 40 years. So then there will be several things are going to happen. First of all, US will be just like before.
per capita GDP would grow in 1.5%, and GDP will grow about 2.3%. So I use the same line to represent the US. Second of all, China will continue to grow. However, China will grow at a slower rate. It was 9.5%, but then due to so-called convergence effect, which means as the per capita GDP for China to become similar to that, closer to that of the US, then the growth rate for China would be declined, right? So what we can assume, they're about 42 years later. So we assume there is a convergence effect. The convergence effect means we assume, so basically we assume in 2060, the per capita, let me emphasize, per capita GDP in China is about 60% to 70% to 80% of the US. Right now, China's per capita GDP is less than 20%. It's about 17% of the US per capita GDP. And so so let's assume in this way. Assume this way. Then, if that's the case, if we assume 2060, China's GDP, per capita GDP is about 60%, 70, 80% of the US, due to convergence effects, just because China has a much larger population. Now it's more than 4 times. In 2060, it's about 3 times, even more than 3 times than US. Then, in that time, the China's GDP, 2060, would be about 2.5 and 2.8 times than US. So China will become the largest economy in the world. And if nothing happens, now China is about 70% of the US size, and then around 2025 or 2028, depends on what's your calculation. China's size will be similar to US, and then in 2060, China's size would be 2.5 times the US. So that is the first scenario. And largely we think 42 years later, the 4th revolution, industrial revolution, will complete. We will have, although we have this artificial intelligence everywhere, right? So you can buy, probably I can buy several robots with me. And when I get old, I can buy several robots to take care of me. So that's a very good life, and then the rest of the world all become much better. So second thing we observed is also right. However, we also observe, because China's size is about 2.5 in the US, then we would think the dominant position of the US in world economy, in world trade, in world governance will change. The world will change to a different global governance system. The reason is just because there's too little population in space. China has a 3 times population than US. India has probably even larger population than US. If you assume convergence effect, and then this size of a country is largely depends on their population. So the question for me to ask is, will US agree with that kind of trend? Will US support this kind of trend? Will US actually just wanted to see the next 40 years were similar to what the 40 years we call a golden growth path in the last 40 years? Okay, so that's a question. Okay, staying on 2018, we observed at least the US government do not want to see that pattern happens. the US government has launched the trade wars, has launched the trade disputes between US and China. So here, I guess most of people agree the trade disputes, trade wars is launched by US, not China, right? So then, as an economist, I needed to actually these several days I got around and ask my friends, and to what's the goal for the U.S.? Why U.S. launched the trade wars against China? What's really the goal? Is this the global imbalance? I was in the fund for 2 years, and we calculated, nah, it's not trade. The IMF says it's not a global imbalance, right? So what's the goal? Okay. Well, let me have a theoretically imagine one possible goal for U.S. to launch the trade war. The reason U.S. launched trade war is to maintain U.S. a #1 position in the world, to maintain the dominant position in economy, in trade, and in global governance. We have heard, or using another words, we have heard presidents of the U.S. repeatedly say to maintain the U.S. leadership in the world. What does that mean? If U.S. want to maintain an effective leadership in the world, then that would be the second scenario. Second scenario means U.S. needs to keep China in 2060, the total GDP not exceed U.S. That would be the second scenario, right? So that's the second scenario. I imagine it's one of the U.S. the goal to launch the trade wars. At least I heard from what I heard some current administrations, that goal is repeatedly mentioned. U.S. need to maintain the leadership. And then what does this mean? How to maintain the leadership? Well, GDP size. Right? So that would be the second scenario. Well, what would be the effects on that scenario on US? Let me just, for simplification, just an assumption. I assume that has no effect on US. From Caroline, the presentation, that won't happen, right? Because there will be a present dilemma. The trade wars would affect China, both China and the US. But let's assume that would be the scenario 2. That's what scenario 2, because China now is significantly slowed down, much lower growth rate. The entire world will become much worse. That's scenario 2. Are there scenario 3? Yes, there would be scenario 3, because the convergence effects will dominate. No matter what US is doing, right now trade from US is only 15% of the world. How China grow is largely depends on China's domestic reasons. So if not for maintain a normal assumptions, China, India, or other countries will still follow the convergence effects. So if the convergence effects will still work, then, well, in short run, yes, China's growth rate will go down, as Carolina estimated, about maybe 1.5% decline. But later on, it will go back to the original growth. So in 2016, basically, the total GDP will still about 2.5% of the states. Nothing changed. So in short run, yes, they are changed. But in long run, as long as the convergence effect is there, as long as the population size is there, then nothing changed. You are still losing a dominant position in the world of the economy, of the trade, just due to population is too small. So, how to solve these problems? Why don't we just go from trade wars? But I have a solution. why don't? Because if the US doesn't like China's size, I think why don't we let 2060, let two countries have equal size? That'd be better, right? How to make it equal size? Well, it's easy. US just open migration from China. That solves all problems. That solves all problems. So the half population stays in China, half the population stay in US. Then everything is okay. When US is slightly have a larger population in China, then you still maintain the dominant position in the world. So then it solves the whole problem. I think. So there are trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs. If US do not want to have an equal population in China, then you need to tolerate population size difference. So that's basically my first diagram. So I look at the long range effect. Although yes, short range the trade wars will change, but the long range doesn't change due to two reasons: convergence effect and population size difference. That's the first thing. First diagram. I used too much time for my first diagram. Okay, so have 5 minutes. Okay. I only have 5 minutes. Let me use 2 minutes to look. Okay, so here is my network of production interdependence. This diagram shows just the world globalization. Actually, is a structure of globalization. Here's European countries, here's Asian countries, here's the U.S., North American countries. And these lines represents which country become the most important partners of other countries. That was 1995. We saw Germany, US, and Japan were key countries in the world for 3 blocks. Here in 2014, China, USA, and Germany are key countries in the world. That's the data before trade wars. That structure will continue. Continue in the sense, given the trade tariffs, that structure even becomes stronger. The stronger means we will have a European value chain, we will have an American value chain, we will have a China value chain. So, my question would be, so here I heard the policy about the so-called isolation of China. I'm not sure, is it isolation of China or isolation of the US? I'm not sure what would be the effects. We can carefully calculate that as well. So that's, but however, we will see the 3 blocks in the world. Then I only have 3 minutes, but let's talk about the future. Okay, the future, theoretical framework. So what would be ideal global governance? Ideal global in 2060, not next year. And then assume there is a benevolent social planners. He would like to design a global governance. And then what he would do. Here I have a theoretical framework. So suppose all countries located from 0 to 1. Each point represents a preference. So then the global governance is represented in the half because it's the shortest, it's the best location for this diversified people. So this is the world governance, this is world governance. Then we could have a regional blocks. Regional blocks is here. So then my question are 2. Suppose we have, first of all, how many regional blocks do we have? Number 1. Number 2, I assume the global governance means public service, public goods provisions. The public goods A, and actually is the public goods, I assume public goods actually using A to represent. Smaller A means people are the preference difference does not matter. The larger A means the preference difference means a lot. Okay, So then I get two results. So here, given my time, I don't have much time. So okay, so here we can compare these two things. We can compare. Here n means number of blocks, and then here nk means administration costs of blocks. Each block, like a NAFTA, like a EU, the administration cost is k. Here n is number of blocks. Larger number of blocks, you have larger administration cost. However, the preference difference loss will be smaller. And globally, this administration cost is high, like a WTO now doesn't work. But then there is no gain for the preference difference. And then you can clearly get one result if the people can tolerate the preference differences. And which means A is small, from 0 to A star, then these public goods should be provided by global governance, like climate change, nuclear weapons, all affect globally, it should be provided by the global governance. And then, so from the A star to A bar, we got these regional issues like the infrastructure and these regional trade things. And then that should be provided by regional blocks, like Asian regional bloc, and then the European regional bloc, and the NAFTA. So that's regional blocks. Then we can have a result. One important result we have says so-called complementarity principles, which I think is interesting. I have these results. If the number of blocks increase, then there should be more public service provided by global governance, which basically I can show both global governance and the regional governance should complement together. And so then in the future, let's say in the 40 years later, so what's my imagination for the global governance? That would be, I call tripolar global governance. There will be regional blocks. There will be global governance like WTO, and the global governance will take care of the global issues like climate change, and the regional blocks will take care of regional issues. And so China, US, and the European Union, and India will all live together and then enjoy together and cooperate together. I think that would be whatever would happen in the next few years. In the next 40 years later, we'll observe that. That's finished my presentation. Thank you.
Mary?
Okay. Well, it's very fun to follow Jiandong, raise some really important, big questions. And I think my talk takes it back down more to micro in today, but also relates back to Carolyn's talk, which was about subsidies. So my paper is really looking at a subsidy, a form of subsidies that I think have kind of snuck under the radar, but actually had a big influence, which is subsidies to FDI. I'm going to try to explain the motivation, and I hope I'll be able to relate it also to some of these bigger questions that Jiandong raised. This is joint work with a former student of mine, Yan Liang. I should have changed this. He's now at San Diego State University. I'm very happy to say he's enjoying California weather. And Hong Chun, who was my China Scholar student for 18 months, and it was a wonderful experience. So we all know about China's export surge, and some people trace back the current crisis to the export surge and the belief that this caused job losses to the United States that were large enough to cause political friction. They were geographically concentrated, they were in industries that may have had special significance, they were certainly geographically concentrated enough in enough important districts to make it important for election outcomes. So that's the idea that China's export surge between its accession to the WTO and the global financial crisis was an important impetus for the frictions and conflicts that we see today. So China's export did surge. They rose from 57 billion in 2001 to 250 billion by 2008. And the export growth was highly concentrated by industries. Now, if we think back to the most well-known discussion of the export surge, it's certainly Otto-Don Hansen and the China shock, which is an entire cottage industry by now. And they argue that the that the export surge was due to China's productivity growth. So they really located in Chinese domestic firms, and that is important for them, both as far as their narrative, but also technically for the construction of their instrumental variables. So how they treat it, how they actually do the work. So it had both a worldview and an econometric rationale. If you look at the job losses that they find, 50% are concentrated in 3 sectors. So this is really a story largely, and none of the others have more than 5% of the total job losses that you're talking about. So we're talking about 3 big sectors and the munchkins, right? So what are those sectors? Well, number 1 is, guess, electronics, right? This is a story of 3 sectors, largely. The other is machinery, right? So these are sectors, and what do we know about those sectors? Those sectors are ones where global value chains exploded. So this is you know, the play without the prince, in a sense, talking about Hamlet. Where are global value chains? Where is foreign investment? Because that is key to understanding what happened to the global economy between 2001 and 2007, in my opinion. So exports surged in sectors where foreign invested enterprises account for a very large share of exports. For exports of electronics to the United States, 70% of those exports are originating in foreign invested enterprises operating in China. So those foreign invested enterprises may be from Hong Kong, they may be from Macau, they may be from Taiwan, they may be from Korea, they may be from Japan, they may be even from the United States, although that's a very small share. So foreign invested enterprises, that is foreign investment, is mediating the majority of trade in these key sectors that we look at as drivers of conflict. So this is new information, I think, for some of you perhaps. This is coming from the China customs records, and we're looking at the share of China's exports that are coming from foreign invested enterprises. And what you see is that, is this actually, whoops, sorry, oh, that's not the right one. I don't know if do we have a pointer? Yeah, there we go. Oh, it doesn't work here. Okay, hence the strolling that I've seen so far. Okay, when you look back at 2000, you see that exports to the United States were always more heavily mediated by foreign invested enterprises. And that's partly reflecting the composition of exports to the United States. By 2004 and 2009, those shares rose dramatically. And in fact, by 2009, this share was almost 70%. This is all exports. So this is not just those that we isolate as heavily FIE mediated or heavily dependent on foreign invested global networks. In 2014, the most recent year for which I have access to data, it's 60% for the United States. So this is not a phenomenon that came and went. This is an important phenomenon that has stayed. And for the United States, it's always been more important than for trade with the rest of the world. And that makes sense, because the trade with China has with the rest of the world includes trade with European Union, but it also includes a lot of trade with countries in East Asia that are its suppliers, and also lower income countries to which it acts as a main supplier of things like cell phones, as opposed to an importer of parts to produce Apple phones for the US. So I think we can see from the slide that foreign investment remains a very important part of the story about the US-China trade relations. So what about Chinese foreign direct investment regulation? Is it different than other countries, or is it just something that just happened naturally? Well, part of it, we know that it is something that happened naturally because it's happened all across the globe. It's not just happened to US companies decided to offshore or outsource from China. It happened all across the globe. But Chinese policy has the same form. The types of policy instruments that China uses are found in lots of other countries. For example, India had many restrictions on foreign investment and many preferences for foreign investment into certain sectors. For example, going back a ways into business services, which they wanted to push. So now they're much more involved in promoting labor-intensive manufacturing to industrialize in that way. So it's not the form. What has been important in China is that they've been relatively restrictive in ownership limits. And this, of course, has become highly politicized because in the US Section 301 case, which is the basis, the legal basis for, in US law, not in international law, in US law for the current tariffs against China, forced technology transfer, which in the view of the US takes the form of forced marriages or forced partnerships with local firms, are due to these ownership restrictions. So, for example, in auto parts, you could come in, but you can't own more than a 49% stake. That would be an example of what we're talking about here with ownership restrictions. And therefore, since you have a partner who may have full view of all your technology, the allegation is that that is a way of forcing technology, particularly if there's rules that require the local partner to have full access to that technology. I'm not really going to speak today about those allegations, but I think what we see is that this particular form and these particular restrictions are important in the debate. Now, are there any disciplines that are imposed by the WTO? And Caroline mentioned in her talk that rules on subsidies there are rules in the WTO, but they're vague, and they omit a lot of different types of subsidies that could be applied. So one of the things is that WTO members agree not to impose trade-related investment measures, and investment restrictions on ownership shares are not trade-related investment measures necessarily. China had separate accession agreements with several countries, and in its accession agreement with the United States, it specifically states that they're not to condition investment approval on tech transfer. That's different than saying they won't have ownership restrictions, which they did, they still do in some sectors, and which would have been addressed by a bilateral investment treaty, but were not prohibited by their accession. They did not promise to remove these by their accession agreement. So it's different, right? And it's always fun to read legalese. I hope I have some lawyers in the audience that I've insulted. No? Okay. All right. Now, why do we care? We care because China is so big and it receives so much foreign investment. So there are lots of other countries that also do this. So, why pick on this guy? And of course, the answer is always size. Size and the use of the foreign investment. So China receives larger FDI flows than any other developing country, and it exports more from those FIEs than any other country. So how does China limit ownership shares? And there's a thing called the category of guidance for foreign investment, and it categorizes sectors by openness to investment. This is a text-based guidance, so it doesn't match up easily to the codes, industrial codes that we use to do our nerdy stuff as economists. But the basic way we think of it is forbidden. There are no foreign investment permitted in certain sectors. An example would be tobacco. That is no foreign investment into tobacco. Like in the US, it's not considered good for public health, but it's also a huge source of government revenue. Restricted investment is by permission and only as a minority shareholder in a joint venture. So an example here would be automobiles, which of course has become important in the political debate. Then there's encouraged sectors. In encouraged sectors, an investor can enter with free to choose the ownership share, so they could take a domestic partner if they want or not. But they also are eligible for certain deals, and I call them deals, but they're encouragements. It may be access to a particularly attractive science and technology park, which will enable them to hire higher skilled workers who want to take advantage of them. Or it may be access to, land for a factory where the sewer lines, the water lines are already there. It may have preferential access to things like university labs. If you're pharma and you need to test products in country to pass the equivalent of the Chinese FDA. So these can take a wide variety of forms. Lastly, there's a whole group of sectors where investment is allowed. If it's above a certain dollar amount or R&D amount, it has to be subject to approval, sometimes at the provincial level, very large deals at the central level. But nevertheless, there are no de jure restrictions on the ownership shares, and call it allowed. So let me just go back there for a minute. So how do we match these two industries that we can use for analysis? And the answer is, fortunately, it was already done. It was done by Shang and Yang, who had an interesting paper on export diversification in the Journal of Development Economics a couple of years ago. And so we're going to use their coding. We have also redone their coding, and they did a great job. So I've already visited Dennis Yang to tell him, hey, you did a great job. He said, I know. So it was a great job. It's very difficult, and it also means that, it's not perfect. We have the same problem in the United States when we look at regulatory changes in the United States and trying to match that up to particular industries. So what do we expect policy to do? Well, encouraging policies are deal specific, but they clearly seem to focus based on anecdotal evidence and firm testimony. They seem to focus on reducing the fixed cost of entry. So it might be, as I said, access to land that's pre-prepared, or other types of fixed costs that you would have to get your product to market. So if we lower the fixed cost of entry, we're clearly going to induce entry by foreign investors. And we should increase exports, unless the product is something where it's only going to be sold domestically. So there could be exports, there could not be, but since many of these foreign investors are selling into global markets, we would expect that there would be exports coming from the operation of a new plant in China. What about restriction? Restricted sectors are those that are closed to wholly owned foreign investments. So we already have joint ventures operating in those sectors. When we open it up to wholly owned foreign investment, we would expect that it would induce entry by wholly owned form, through the wholly owned form. And if you're familiar with the profile of foreign investment into China, you knew that China liberalized much of its foreign investment regime with its WTO, to its accession to the WTO. And we see a very dramatic break point where prior to that point, most investment took the form of joint venture partnerships. After that, the dominant form becomes the entry of wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign corporations. So we have this dramatic change, and yet we still see some entry as a joint venture, and clearly part of that is due to policy. You have to have one, but not all of it. Nevertheless, when we remove restrictions that require a JV, we should expect to see an increase in wholly owned foreign subsidiaries. Okay, now, does the Chinese government encourage FDI often? So these are the share of 4-digit sectors where some products within those sectors are listed as encouraged. So it won't be everything that's in the large 4-digit sector. So if you're in, say, automobiles, it could be some section in auto parts, say electronics, as opposed, it doesn't have to be, seats. So it's if you have any sectors that are encouraged, and we see that rises from about 1/4 of all sectors in China to 43% by 2007 with a steady progression. Here is the data and the major changes. So the catalog doesn't change every year. It changes at discrete points in time. And we see a general trend toward liberalization. So prior to WTO accession, about 25% of sectors were encouraged, and about 15% of sectors were ones where wholly owned foreign investment was not allowed. By 2010, 43% of sectors are encouraged, and only about 7% of sectors have products within them where entering as a wholly owned subsidiary is not allowed. So a very dramatic liberalization trend. Now, which sectors are these might be of interest to you. And so we divided all the 480 four-digit Chinese industrial sectors up into three broad groups. One is what I call high-tech. The other is capital-intensive and labor-intensive. So how do we define these sectors? High-tech are those that are defined by the Chinese government as high-tech sectors, and they would include all the ones you would think of, including transportation, aircraft, aerospace, pharma, advanced chemicals, especially electronic chemicals, so things like this. And they're in the blue line, the high-tech sector. And you see that they've always been, as a group, the share of those sectors that are encouraged has always been higher than either of the other two sectors. The other two sectors, we just look at capital labor ratios, pick those above the median, and to call them capital intensive below the median, in the capital labor is labor intensive. And you can see that all three groups were liberalized in the sense that, not liberalized, I would say encouraged after 2001, that is with this session. It was also a revision of the catalog on foreign investment, and they were further liberalized in 2007. But by 2007, almost 60% of those industries that are listed as high-tech were already encouraged, that is available for special deals. Which sectors were restricted? Well, interestingly enough, high-tech sector was also most likely to be restricted, with 20% of those sectors restricted at the time of prior to WTO accession, and that share dropping dramatically with accession. We also see drops in the share of sectors that require you to take a joint venture partner, both in capital-intensive industries and labor-intensive industries, where really it's very, very narrow sectors. There's very few sectors in that sector where you would have, in those industries where you would have to take a joint venture partner. Okay, what are some industries designated as high-tech? Chemicals, medical and pharmaceutical products, special engineering equipment, communications, computers, other electronics. So this includes just all cell phone stuff. These are very broad categorizations. Instruments, meters, and office machinery. These are all areas where China's share of global trade has increased rapidly since 2000. Okay, what do we do with what we've assembled? So we want to ask, does foreign investment activity change when a sector is encouraged or restricted? We're really interested in the removal of restrictions. So as I said before, I think there's some policy changes out there that are flying under the radar, and these are the FDI subsidization. And what I want to know is, when Chinese policies change, how much of a bang do they get for their buck? Do they get a lot of entry, and do we see that changing the volume of exports? So we're going to compare very similar to what Nancy did with her data. We're going to compare before and after activity in the sectors that are treated, where our treatment is either now you're eligible for special deals if you come in and you're an investor who wants to do activity X in our country, or alternatively, the treatment is we're going to take this sector and we're going to remove the requirement that you have a JV partner. And we're going to compare those to industries where there's no policy change, which is this large set of industries where foreign investment is simply allowed. There's no entry mode restrictions. And then we have to worry about endogeneity, because we might think that the Chinese would carefully pick which industries they want to liberalize in this way. So for example, with allowing wholly owned foreign investment, it may be ones where the sector is already fairly mature and there's no worry anymore that foreigners would come in and dominate the sector with their wholly owned plants. And so we need to worry that they're picking sectors where exports are already ready to explode, that the sector is mature, that the Chinese no longer have to fear dominance by foreign investors. So to do that, we're going to do what's called a triple dip. We're going to compare entry and exporting patterns in industries that are foreign invested, treated industries to domestic firms in that industry. Because if this story is true, we should see exports growing from both foreign invested enterprises and domestic enterprises. And we should be seeing entry by both foreign investors and domestic. Did I miss anything I wanted to say there? I might have. We'll come back always in good thing. Yeah, so we're going to compare before and after for foreign firms who are treated to before and after for domestic firms who technically should not be treated because the law said they're not eligible for these special benefits when they come in. Lastly, we want to guard against the fact that there may be other things that are going on. And in the literature, we've already had a lot of explanations for the export surge. In particular, we're going to be looking at the granting of permanent normal trade relations by the United States. And this, of course, is something that's already been shown in the literature to have induced entry and exports and job losses into the United States with a series of papers by Kyle Hanley and Nunu Lamau on the one hand, and then Justin Pierce and Peter Schott on the other. So we're going to want to control for that. We're going to want to control for other things that have also been shown, particularly by Rod Feenstra and a set of co-authors, which include changes in tariffs in China. Okay, so which activities do we expect to be influenced by policy? Include pickup, would be entry by new foreign enterprises. We should see more entry. We should see more entry of firms that export, so exporter entry, and we should be seeing changes in the export volume. Work that we're doing now using actually China customs records is looking at the intensity of existing relationships. Do they export more in relationships they already have? Do we see exports of new products to new destinations, which is something that we would expect to see if allowing wholly owned foreign investors in actually brings in better technology. We should be seeing Chinese products being able to penetrate more advanced markets that have higher demands for the products. And then we want to look at exports to the United States only. Okay, so this is just a graph that is similar to the one that Nancy showed. It's no real analytics here. We're looking at, on the one hand, foreign enterprises, and on the other, domestic. And we didn't just look at encourage, look at the sector that was most likely to be encouraged or to have a change, and that is the high-tech sector. These are domestic enterprises, foreign enterprises, domestic enterprises. And what, of course, you see is that with WTO accession, foreign enterprises really see a great growth spurt in terms of their export values. Domestic firms in the same sector, high-tech and others, seem to have a very similar pattern. So it seems like something is happening there, and of course we need to make sure that it's what we think it is. So we're going to use the Chinese manufacturing census for 1998 to 2010. This does omit smallest firms. It does provide the other information that we need. So we are working right now with Chinese customs records because it's the universe of exports. We're not able to ask the same rich menu of questions, but we are to dig deep, do a deep dive into some of the export pattern changes that we would see. Okay, so just some pictures, because I'm running out of time, says that mean old guy named Steve in the back. But if you look at so here what we do is we just take as zero the year that the policy is changed. So what we see is in encouraged sectors, and this is differences between what happens in treated sectors and untreated sectors. And what we find is there's no real difference between treated sectors and untreated sectors prior to the treatment. After the treatment, we see a big increase in the number of firms in treated sectors. Unrestricted, you can kind of think of this. This would be if you added a restriction. We could do it the other way, which is what we're seeing is the removal of restrictions would be more enlightening probably. But no big trend prior to, and then we see a big decrease. So what you do is it restricts wholly owned entry, and removal induces entry, and those firms export. Okay, and this is similar for the number of foreign exporters. You see similar trends. So no pre-trend, but you get a big bump up with the policy, and this is export values, which of course we're very interested Okay, so just looking at some of the numbers, so as Nancy mentioned, do the regressions we control for industry and year fixed effects, a whole variety of fixed effects. Here we're just looking at foreign investment. This is all foreign invested enterprises right here. And we see encouraged, loosely speaking, raises the number of firms by about 14%. So then we divide it into joint ventures, a joint venture sample, and a wholly owned foreign invested sample. So those two together form all FIEs. And we also see positive effects for both of those. When we look at restricted sectors, we see a big decrease, a significant decrease in the number of firms that enter as wholly owned. Looking at the bottom two panels, similar patterns for the number of exporters. And we have a less precise here on export values, but overall for the large sample where we pool them, we see a big increase in 36% increase in export values from the treated sectors overall. I should say right now we are separating these out between so-called Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan firms and foreign firms. Those may be of interest because of the belief that they have technological differences. Here's where we triple difference. So now instead of just comparing those that are treated in treated sectors, non-treated sectors, we're now going to compare what happens to foreign firms to domestic firms. So use the domestic firms as a control group. And we see that the results are even stronger. We see that relative to their domestic peers, foreign invested enterprises in treated sectors, we see we're more likely to get entry, we're more likely to get entry of exporters, and we're more likely to see an increase in export values. Okay, findings. Encouraging, raises the number of foreign enterprises by about 14%, raises the number of foreign exporters by 15%, and it raises the value of exports from foreign invested enterprises by 36%. Removing restrictions, limiting wholly owned foreign firms reduces the number, restrictions reduced by 15, and we don't see any effect on values of exports from WFOEs. So it does lead to entry, but they tend to serve the domestic market. I have to say, I didn't really highlight it, but we find no significant effect on domestic industries from treatment. So just as you would think, these policies should only be used for foreign investors, and that seems to be the case. I just want to show you one thing we've done, which is sort of a partial equilibrium aggregation of our results. We say, okay, let's think about what the world would have looked like with these encouraging policies and without. And the blue is the total increase in export values, which you see falls off sharply with the global financial crisis. The red is what we predict that the exports would be in the absence of these policies that promote and kind of grease the wheels for the development of global value chains. Do they change the composition of China's exports? Because that has also been an interest. Why are China's export bundles seem so sophisticated? And of course, the answer to that has always been, well, the value added in the most significant, sophisticated industries by China is actually very low. So they're not producing, the fantastic Gorilla Glass that's on the iPhone. They're producing something else inside the iPhone, and they're doing assembly. But here we see that this entry of foreign investors also influences the composition of China's exports. And this is done, I think, prior to our extending the sample. So it's between 2000 and 2007. And you see that it looks like our estimates suggest that they raised the share of their exports, which are counted as high tech. And again, remember, this is heavily dependent on cell phones and computers and machinery. You're seeing, this is, I said, a tale of three industries. It goes from 61% of so-called high tech to almost 67%. So in a short period of time, it really does change China's export profile. Okay, does it matter? I think it does matter. Obviously, forced tech transfer is a major complaint. How much of the encouragement is a quid pro quo? We don't know. We talk a lot about China and the use of the stick. What about the use of honey? This is a very important question. Is using honey not allowed? I mean, that's an important question, right? So, and if you get the honey, that is a sweet deal, what do you give up? If you talk to companies, a lot of companies will say this. And so we know, at least I think, on the basis of this work, that the honey does matter. Honey helps. Honey works. The policies are not just doing nothing. They're actually having an effect that effect is influencing global trade patterns, and it's influencing the composition of China's exports. And I think it's time we focus a little bit less on vinegar and a little more on honey. Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Mary has a bottle of water.
We have some questions out there. Right here, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your insightful presentations. I'm now at Aoyama, a staff writer correspondent for Japan's newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun. And I have a question for both of you, Dr. Ju and Dr. Lovely. So today, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe met Chinese President Xi Jinping, and hoping to strengthen cooperative ties with China. But I think Japan is in a very difficult position. Japan is challenging the rise of China, sharing the U.S. goal of addressing the so-called unfair trade practices, while Japan is also discouraging the United States from falling victim to protectionism and isolationism. So, many Japanese think that for Japan there is no choice but to strengthen the ties with the United States, whose military protects Japan. So, what do you think about this apparent rapprochement between Japan and China amid the U.S.-China dispute, and what do you think about Japan's role in this exponentially changing geoeconomic landscape?
Okay, that's why you take one question right there.
Glad we started with a small
Hold on 1 second.
Steve Landy, a private consulting firm, Manchester Trade. Very good at asking a short question. Two quick observations. Observation number one is, I wish that Mr. Jiandong can talk to Mr. Trump about our immigration policy, because many of us would like to see the caravan arrive in the United States and help make the U.S. a larger population. And two, what does amaze me, you are located 4 blocks from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and I don't know why. Instead of students, we don't have 50 trade negotiators here, but this has been really educational and might even help the U.S. in terms of the negotiation. My quick questions are, one, according to the press, the U.S. is having a lot of trouble not only deciding when they want to negotiate with China, meaning when they think enough pressure has been applied, but what they want to ask China for. And the Chinese authorities have said innumerably, we don't know what the U.S. wants. Based on what you've discussed today, I guess my question is, what would you suggest that the U.S. should ask for in these negotiations in order to get a hold of this particular policy machine? Let me just stop there. Let me make one question. Thank you.
Let's start with that. You want to start, Mary?
Well, I can start talking about Japan. I mean, I think the role that Japan has played so far has been crucial, particularly in continuing to lead the movement to CPTPP. So I think that is an accomplishment and a contribution to the world that we all should be thankful to Japan for. I think that the TPP we've seen already has had a beneficial impact in that even with the NAFTA agreement, it's hard to see how it would have been brought to a successful conclusion, the USMCA, without following in the mold of the TPP. So, and there's also some hope that China will eventually seek to join the TPP. So Japan's role has been crucial. Japan as a faithful friend that can lead to moderation of U.S. approach to China is incredibly important, and one that I certainly hope we will be able to rely upon.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think so my title, Asian Community,
it's not my concept. It's raised by the former Japanese Prime Minister in the 1990s, right? I don't remember his name. So Asian communities. So that's so the deeper East Asia, the economic integration was actually pushed by the Japanese government and was not actually, my memory, if it's correct, it was not supported by US at that moment. However, I think the even for 20 years later, you can clearly see the Asian value chain is there. So there should be more cooperations between Asian countries, including, I think that Japan and China should work together to have deeper Asian integration. So that, I think, it's a very, very positive move by the Japanese government, and also very positive by Chinese government, and that's a good thing. Your question, you say the Japan's the rule is difficult. I don't think so. From our research, when the U.S. and China has trade wars, there would be a third country effect, right? The third countries are happier. So your result shows the third country will be happier. So I think the Japan, if there are something, the Japan will gain from it. So I do not think the Japan's position will be more difficult. But certainly it's very crucial and very important. So to push what you raised 20 years ago about Asian community, to work together with China and to reform these global governments, that would be the important task, I think. First, second question for Michael.
Yes, what do you think about the apparent rapprochement between China and Japan at this moment?
They are approaching, they are converging, right? So Japan is leading the TPP. Possibly China may willing to join TPP as well. Because US already exited from it, so it's why not, right? I don't think there's much obstacles between Japan and China to work together. I don't think that the two countries should work together. There's no obstacles between two countries in economic integrations. That's one thing. For migration, is the question to me?
You can answer.
Is it a European migration or is migration in U.S. policy?
I think his question, he was his comment. I think
Right.
the question really is, what would we recommend the US ask for from China? So.
Right, yeah. So I think it's a very good question, and it is confused to, I believe, not me, not China is confused, even administration themselves are confused. So they want really, because these several days I'm keeping asking what's the goal, what's the tool, why, what do you want to reach, what do you want to reach agreements between US and China. Here I think I have one observation. The past 40 years globalization, the achievements was driven by US and China, mainly by these two countries. And now US say, no, I don't want to work together as well. So US wanted to isolate China. But let me mention that according to retailing revenue, for example, the automobile sales this year, China has become the largest market in the world. So that pattern will not change. So if US is willing to isolate it from the largest market in the world, I'm not sure which side will be hurt more. So that's, I definitely do not know. So I think there are issues. There are important issues like industrial policy issues. There are intellectual property rights protection issues. And then there are many issues. I do suggest two countries sit down and then to discuss for these issues and invite all of these economists, invite us to examine, to investigate what is really there, and what's the violations, what's the agreements, and then keep work together to push another 40 years in the future. I think that will work better. no matter, as I discussed here, no matter what U.S. side do, next 40 years in 2060 will be similar. It won't change that much.
So maybe I could add something from the work that I've been doing on foreign direct investment, because the Section 301 report is really about investment, right? How investment is treated. If we take the report, which I said before, is the legal basis for the tariffs, and ignore the other stuff about buying natural gas and all that stuff, there are things that China could do to reassure the United States and companies operating in the United States that they're being treated fairly in terms of their intellectual property. The interesting thing, of course, is that would lead to more offshore, not less. So the irony of this is that it's being sold as a pro-America policy, but it really would lead to more offshoring, which I, for one, think actually does strengthen our ability to compete worldwide, but a lot of people would disagree with that. So if we did have a sort of a rational ability to settle these issues, it would actually make China a more, not less attractive destination for investment globally, because there's lots of other countries that have the same issues that we do with China and worry about their intellectual property. So then you have to ask, well, what else could China do? And clearly it's market access. Market access has been denied in financial services and in other areas. And China could open up. It wants to open up. The U.S., for its part, could recognize that it's hard to open up to financial flows. It leads to instability, domestic instability, as China saw in 2015. So I think that there is, if we, in a rational world, we would have things we need from each other. They would have economic impacts that are very different from those that President Trump talks about, but nevertheless would lead to a world with more trade, more efficiency, and greater wealth.
A couple of quick questions, and we have to go quick right here, please.
Hi, this is a question for Mary Lovely. You talked about how at the time of the last presidential election, it was immigration that was more on the minds of folks than trade. And I was struck by your description of the facts behind the China shock, which industries had the most losses, because from a political perspective, it seems to me it's more like the furniture makers in North Carolina and like televisions more than cell phones. I mean, a lot of the computer stuff you're talking about is in California, which is not what we think of as the anti-trade, turn of the electorate. But my question is, given that there seems to be near unanimity in Congress and on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue that China must be confronted around trade, what do you think is going to be the outcome? I saw on your last slide you said maybe CFIUS should change to talk about restrictions of American firms working in China. What do you think that, we go from here as far as satisfying the political argument that China must be confronted?
Okay, first one, I didn't say anything about immigration. But I did talk about the industries. Furniture would be
I'm sorry, that was the World Bank.
Furniture would be the next one on my list. TVs do end up in electronics, so they're in the very first one. So, and while we may think of California as a reliable blue state, there are many people within California who've changed, just voted for Trump. So, I was thinking more in terms of places that were hurt, or individuals rather than, but we know if we aggregate because of economic concentration or agglomeration of industries, we do end up with Michigan and Pennsylvania. So on the CFIUS thing, CFIUS, of course, is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. That's about inward foreign investment. We are going to get heightened scrutiny, although, again, we're ahead of our skis because we don't even really know what emerging technology is. We're having a pilot program now, so we're going to figure that out. I think a lot of people feel that the actual legislation was pretty good. It was much better than we feared because it would have been huge bureaucratic overreach. So they're happy with what came out with FIRMA. What we do on outward foreign investment is just a complete unknown at this point. So, but again, scrutinizing investment carefully might be one way we can deal with these fears of giving away, the entire cookie jar, right, of our tech secrets. So, but again, the fear always is that it will be used for protectionist purposes and it will be subject to capture by special interests. Mm-hmm. So those things. I would also take some, perhaps I'm naive, but I would contest your point that also, that the U.S. government is unified in its belief that we need to confront China. It's how you interpret that word confront. We clearly have issues, and Carolyn, I think, outlined some of the issues that have been really frustrating, including just a lack of progress in moving to liberalize because of the Doha round, just basically, going away. So I would say, what do you mean by confront? I do not see unanimous support for this. In fact, I believe that this is basically a pretty unpopular thing. Carolyn showed the opinions that we see when we ask American households. There aren't any American businesses except those that are directly, like, yes, steel, but there's no steel using, that are supporting the tariffs. So I would say that this narrative that Americans are united behind the
I
tariffs
don't
is
think
wrong.
Americans are, but I think that
I don't even-
Congress is.
Congress represents us. And maybe some people here may find that funny, I understand that. Still, they will listen to their constituents, and as the pain gets bigger, I believe that they will listen, because the screams will get louder. So, at least that's my hope. So,
Okay, I'm sorry to say, we're gonna have to cut it short and move on to the next panel. What's next, Kyle?
First, let's give them a
Let's
round.
first.